welcome back to another video on my channel. I am joined by Casper because I feel like Casper hasn't been in a video in a minute, and we're going to talk about ball pythons a little bit today too, so might as well have Casper be out for it. But in today's video, we're going to be discussing the addiction of reptiles and 3 of the most addictive reptiles that are most common in the hobby. So usually when the word addiction is used, it's not a positive thing. And a lot of the times, even when you're dealing with something like the addiction of reptiles, like, it sounds silly and people probably think like that's not a real thing. But from like my own experiences and seeing like other people, it seems like when a lot of people get reptiles, they can't just have one, especially with these particular species that I'm going to talk about. It's kind of like popcorn. You get one and you just want another and another and another. And that can be a great thing if you're able to provide a good life for your animals. However, that's not always the case and it can be problematic. So I just wanted to have a discussion and talk about my thoughts on all of it. And just go over some of these ideas and just things to think about if you own any of these species or you want any of these species, and just things to keep in mind to make sure that you can give them a good life, because ultimately that's what matters most. So we're going to dive into the first species, which is ball pythons. So ball pythons are amazing, amazing pets. I do not typically recommend them for beginners. However, a lot of people do say that they are okay for beginners, and a lot of beginners do happen to get them. And that is okay, again, as long as you do your research and you can provide the right care. The reason why I don't typically recommend them for beginners is because their care can be a little bit challenging, especially with humidity and feeding strikes, and all of that stuff can be pretty stressful for beginners, which is why I just think it's better to just have a little bit more experience under your belt before you get one of these guys. But other than all of that, if you can give them good care, they are so docile for the most part. Every snake is going to have its own personality. My very first ball python was like a demon. That's mean to say. He was very, very defensive. We'll just put it that way. My other ball pythons since Casper and Chaos are just delightful. I absolutely love them. And I think that the number one thing that makes them most addictive are their different colors and patterns and morphs, because there are so many. They are absolutely stunning animals. I mean, look at Casper here. He's a blue-eyed leucistic ball python. He's got the most gorgeous blue eyes and he's just completely solid white, and he's one of my dream morphs, and I'm so happy I was able to get him. So the morphs definitely make them more appealing and more addicting, because once you have one, you just want to keep going and get another one and get another one. And another thing when it comes to the addiction of ball pythons is that a lot of people, once they start collecting all of these morphs, they think, wow, I have all of these great morphs, I should just start breeding my own. And they want to produce and hopefully try to make money off of it. So I have talked about my thoughts on becoming a breeder in the hobby in the past, but I will go over it again. If you are looking to breed animals and your main goal is to make money, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And I feel like a lot of people want to get into breeding ball python morphs specifically just to try and make money, because the morphs can go for thousands of dollars, and that is definitely appealing to a lot of people. However, you have to keep in mind that you buying the animals in the first place, giving them the proper care and all of that, all of it can become expensive. So you can't guarantee that you're going to always make a ton of money doing something like this. If it's something you're passionate about and you really do love the animal, I'm all for breeding. I just think that too many people try to do it for the wrong reasons, which is why I just wanted to mention it. The other thing is, when you are kind of collecting, that's such a weird term because these are living creatures, but if you are collecting these animals because you're addicted to them and you just keep buying them and you just love having them, if you have, depending on the certain amount that you have, you may not have a decent amount of space to be able to give each animal that they deserve. So I do want to talk about the size requirements, because a lot of people with ball pythons, especially breeders, they typically like to keep them in racking systems, which is okay. It's adequate. Yes, the animal is alive, but is the life of that animal enriched? I'd say no. So I typically am not for racking systems. If you do want a lot of ball pythons and you love them and you're passionate about them, I think it's important to give them the amount of space that they deserve. So the amount of space that I would recommend for ball pythons would be a minimum of a 4x2 enclosure. So if you are able to do that, give your animal an amazing home, and you just happen to want to get more and can provide the space, there's nothing wrong with that. I just think that when it comes to the addiction of reptiles, it is critically important to make sure that you are providing sufficient, adequate, even above the average care for each animal as you possibly can. I think that should be the goal for every animal that you keep in general anyway. They just deserve all the space, all the enrichment, all the attention that they need to make sure that they have a fulfilled and good, happy life with you. So if you are just kind of feeding more into the addiction of getting a big number of animals rather than the care of the animals, that's when I think it becomes problematic. So that's basically why I wanted to make this entire video, just to discuss these things, because it's important to make sure that you are giving them the right amount of care and space, and you're not feeding more into the addiction rather than the care of the animals that you have. So that is all I have to say about ball pythons. So again, here is Casper. He's just a little adventurous noodle today. So now we're going to move on to the next reptile that I think is very highly addictive in the hobby. So the next animal that I want to talk about, I was going to take one out for the video. However, all of them are sleeping and I don't want to disturb them. So, and that is crested geckos. Crested geckos are very, very highly addicting because mainly they are pretty small. They don't take up a lot of space when housing them, and they are very simple to take care of. Again, everyone should be doing their research before getting an animal to make sure that it is something that they can handle. They do require a higher humidity. That can be a little tricky again, so it is important to make sure you do that research. But for the most part, once you do that research and you get one of these animals, you realize that they are very, very easy to take care of. They're charming, they're derpy, they're beautiful, and again, they come in a wide range of morphs, which is just highly appealing, and that's like part of the addiction. Once you get one, you see all of these other glamorous morphs, and then you want those as well, so you just keep getting them. So it's pretty much the same thing with ball pythons. You do want to make sure that you are feeding more into the care of each individual animal before just buying more and more and feeding the addiction. So my recommendations for crested geckos, the minimum enclosure for them is actually the 18 by 18 by 24. However, I slightly kind of disagree with this just based on my own experiences. I like to use the 2 by 2 by 2 Zen Habitats enclosures. And ever since I upgraded to that, I just realized that that is so much more space for them. So that is the requirement that I think is the best minimum. So that's typically what I would recommend. I do also keep I have two crested geckos that aren't in Zen Habitats because the lack of room. I would love to be able to stack them on the shelf behind me, but they will not fit because they're just too wide and too bulky. So I do keep my last two crested geckos, Chip and Bamboo, in 30-gallon enclosures tipped on their side. And then I use the snake clips to keep the screen on because the screen is on the front. So that is also adequate. It's not my favorite. It gives them enough space, I think. It's very tall and kind of slim, so they don't have a lot of width, but they do have a lot of height. But I think that width and height are just so important when it comes to crested geckos. So eventually I would love to get them both in the 2 by 2 by 2 Zen Habitats enclosures once I have more space. But yeah, so those are the basic recommendations for housing. I feel like a lot of people are really good with crested geckos. I typically don't see them in too small of enclosures. Some of them are growing out. They do start off in smaller enclosures and upgrade over time. Ball pythons, you definitely see a lot of people keeping them in like racking systems, which I just don't like. However, I do feel like the people that do kind of collect crested geckos do a fairly great job of making sure that their housing is adequate, and they obviously aren't going to be cohabitating any of them. All of them have their own space, And for the most part, whenever I see crested gecko enclosures, it seems like people know what they're doing. So I always appreciate that. But it is a little bit dangerous when you get a crested gecko because they are like popcorn. You just completely fall in love, and each one has its own personality, and it just makes you want more and more. So it is something to talk about. And the last animal that I want to talk about are leopard geckos. So I was able to get Kiwi. Look how cute that little face is. So leopard geckos are one of the most popular reptiles. I mean, all of the ones I'm discussing today are very popular, but they're just very, very common. They are one of the ultimate beginner reptiles that I recommend for anyone. If you are new to reptile keeping and you want a reptile, a leopard gecko is absolutely the way to go. As you can see, the size is not too big. And people, I think, here's the thing with leopard geckos. They like to cohabitate these guys. They think that they can tolerate it because a lot of people have done it in the past. They don't typically have issues. So then they think it's okay. And so a lot of people do that. And that also feeds into the addiction, because if you can just keep multiple in an enclosure, that makes people think, oh, I can just keep getting more and more and it's going to be okay. It's absolutely not. So that's why I want to talk about them in today's video. These guys are fantastic animals, and they each are very solitary. They each need their own space. You do not want to stress these guys out and put them with other geckos, even if they aren't completely fighting each other, which they can. So even if you notice that your leopard gecko isn't fighting another leopard gecko when you're keeping them together in an enclosure, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will never fight. And it also does not mean that your animal is not stressed out. A lot of the times one will like go on top of the other, things like that. And people kind of anthropomorphize that, and they think, oh, they're cuddling. It's cute. They like each other. They love each other. That's not what it is. They could actually be competing for the heat of that spot. It could also be dominant behavior. All of that can lead to stress for the individual animal. So it's very important to make sure that they each have their own enclosure. You never ever want to cohabitate the leopard geckos. So again, I feel like a lot of people, that feeds their addiction. They're like, well, it's so easy. They can just keep multiple in one same enclosure. Don't do that. Don't be that person. Make sure that each leopard gecko gets their own amount of space. The other thing is that a lot of people think they don't require much space, even if you are keeping one leopard gecko in one enclosure. They think that like a 20-gallon is okay. It used to be the standard. However, it is not the standard any longer. Now the minimum requirement is actually a 40-gallon enclosure. And I did keep Kiwi in a 40-gallon. I think they need a little bit more space than that. They're pretty adventurous geckos. They can be very active. Obviously during the day they're going to be sleeping, so a lot of people don't think they're that active, but I swear they're active. So my recommendation for a leopard gecko enclosure is actually the 4x2x16 from Zen Habitats, only because I've used it with Kiwi and I can see the amount of floor space that I'm able to give him, and I absolutely love it. So that is what I would recommend. If you don't have enough space for that, a 40-gallon is sufficient. My own preference is the 4x2x16. It doesn't give them a lot of height because they don't need a ton for climbing. They still get enough climbing space in the 4x2x16. And I love front opening doors. That's like another main seller for me. So you can't do that with tanks, which is another reason I just don't like tanks at all anymore. But if that is something that you want to do, you can. So yeah, I just wanted to make that clear. It's very important to give them a pretty decent amount of space because they can be active, and you do want to make sure they each have their own enclosure. So that may feed the addiction a little bit less if you realize that the animals need a little bit more space and you can't house them all together. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Leopard geckos are endearing. They're so cute. And they can come in a ton of different morphs, and that is just highly, highly addictive for keepers to just want to keep getting all of these different colors and patterns. So yeah, those are my thoughts on some of the most, where are you going, addictive reptiles in the hobby, and some of my concerns about it, and just what I think the size requirement should be for these species. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about it in a video because I think it's important. If you guys have any other thoughts or you think there are any other species that should be included in today's video that are highly addictive, please go ahead and leave it in my comment section. I would love to hear your thoughts on this one, and I will see you guys in the next one.